I avoid spoilers, but once I've seen the movie, I am desperate to go and find out what people really thought, what they thought of specific things. So while most people still haven't seen Avengers Endgame, I wanted to get my initial thoughts on specific plot elements and spoilers out for people that have seen it and are really psyched to hear what other people think about it. And of course, maybe there's some people out there that love finding out spoilers. To each their own. So I just want to talk about a few things that I noticed, and specifically a couple things that went over people's heads. Some specific motifs or homages to earlier in the MCU history or earlier in Marvel comic history that everybody in my group, I had about 8 people in our group, and none of them caught a couple of these. So without further ado, I'm just going to jump into it. As I mentioned in my spoiler-free video, kind of like drained, really starting to recover a little bit at this point. I'm about 2 into my cocktail beverage to try and calm my jangled nerves, and starting to work, starting to regain my composure. And but still, it was just so draining. That movie was such an emotional roller coaster. Professor Hulk, I thought Professor Hulk was very cool. It was very good to see him. It's very cool to see that they have been open to like doing some different stuff with Hulk, especially seeing as they don't do solo movies with him. So you'd think you'd be a little bit more reluctant to change that character without, getting to explore that character arc in a solo movie. Even though Ragnarok, he was pretty much a co-star, I guess. So that was very cool. Very cool to see just new things that they were bringing with the character. Kind of a bummer to know that's going to be Ruffalo's last outing with the character, but whatever. It was very cool. I loved it. Oh, also on the Hulk, this is something that I think a lot of people, especially if you're not an old school comic book fan, would have gone completely over your head. But the moment when Thanos attacks the Avengers mansion, and a bunch of the characters are like, they were either in the basement or just fell into the pit that his energy blast created. Not exact. I think they were already floors down below ground. Anyways, all the facility is like kind of collapsing on them, and water's filling up, and the Hulk is holding up all of the Avengers mansion debris that is about to crush all the people, but he's only holding it off, and so the water's rising, so there's some tension. But that is, a lot of people that don't know the old school comics wouldn't realize that is a complete visual reference to Secret Wars #4. And I tell you, the Russo brothers have said that they'll come back to the MCU if Feige gets around to doing a Secret Wars adaptation. So they know Secret Wars. They know that series. This is not a coincidence, because in issue 3, the heroes are attacked by the villains. You don't really need to know much about the story, just that it's heroes versus villains. The villains are attacking, and the heroes are barely escaping on the run, and the Molecule Man says, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it," and picks up a mountain range with his powers and drops them on all of the heroes. I remember buying that issue, and I remember going to my local convenience store and checking the spinner rack for the next issue. And when I saw issue #4, it was like I said, punch in the face. I was blown away by the drama. I mean, almost the entire cover is just rock, and at the bottom of the cover is Hulk holding up all that rock, barely so that all of the heroes are surviving. I mean, that was just one of the great dramatic covers of my early comic book collecting. I never forgot it. I ran into Bob Layton, the artist of that cover, when he was at a comic convention a couple of years ago, and I just made a beeline to him, and I said, "That's one of the best covers I've ever seen in my life. I love it." And so that's definitely a reference to Secret Wars #4. The Russos put that in there, I guarantee it. I think one important thing to mention, now that we're in spoiler territory, is the very opening scene. I have been one of the people that's been very disappointed in the MCU Hawkeye, and I actually hate, the word is correct, hate that they went with the Ultimate Comics version of Hawkeye and not the standard mainline Marvel 616 version of Hawkeye, because I love Hawkeye. I started collecting comics in the early 80s, and so I got a lot of 70s back issues in the quarter bins, and he had such a great arc and such a interesting relationship with Captain America, very antagonistic. He always had this chip on his shoulder because he was coming from a point of being a reformed criminal. Anyways, this movie has Hawkeye's greatest moments, and it's funny, the one thing you know going into it is that he becomes Ronin. Ronin is a character from Marvel Comics, and in the movie, Hawkeye adopts the visage of and armament and weapons of and style of Ronin. It wasn't Hawkeye in the comics that did that, but not that that matters really. And that actually was for me, the weakest of the Hawkeye material, even though I typically gravitate towards the more spectacle elements, the action of, what the comic book visuals can bring to a live-action cinematic endeavor. It was really the quiet moments. The first scene with Hawkeye, well, the first scene of the movie, and that is with Hawkeye, when his family is dusted, there were just gasps throughout the theater. It was just a powerful moment. One thing I said in my spoiler-free review is, this is a movie that should be seen in the theater with a crowd, and that was a big part of it. To hear the emotional responses from people, sometimes echoing mine, sometimes greater or lesser than mine, whatever. It was just the whole spectrum was, very, very interesting, and it, to me, added to the experience. Of course, as a journalist, I am kind of interested in other people's, reactions to things, maybe a little bit more than an average film goer. Usually you don't go to a film and you're thinking, hey, what's that guy in the third row think? So I was very rewarded by, or it just felt that it was very cool to hear those people's emotional responses at the moment, including the people in my group. There were a couple moments where friends of mine to my left or right, laughed way harder than I did, or cheered harder than I did when a heroic moment happened, and it was very interesting to hear people's responses to what was going on. Of course, many of the times I was the loudest cheering, I guess, but so the Hawkeye moment, the thing I think that's so interesting about the film is that it is just packed with all of these, just so many moments, so many great little character moments, and I bet some people might, even consider it like fan service or whatever. Oh, you got Tony Stark, seeing his dad and having that conversation or whatever. Fair enough, but I don't think that. First of all, the film just was very well paced, in my opinion. I didn't feel bored. I didn't, Captain Marvel, while I liked it, it did sag a bit in the middle, and this movie is 45 minutes longer or more, and I didn't feel sag. I mean, I was completely engaged through the entire time. Okay, so back to spoilers. Let's talk a little bit more about that. I went into it with only, I think, one spoiler revealed to me, and that was I was watching a live stream of Robert Burnett. If you've heard of the fellow, he wrote and produced or directed Free Enterprise, which is a classic film if you're into sci-fi fandom. It was kind of like what Galaxy Quest was to the actors of Star Trek, Free Enterprise was to the fans of Star Trek. And William Shatner, of course, was in it. Anyways, really interesting, smart guy, and so I've really started to love his channel, and I was watching a stream just a couple days ago. I had made it so close to Avengers, and people, there were a couple trolls in the chat that were, and of course he's reading the questions from the chat, and so he starts reading this question only to find out that it's a someone trying to spoil the end, specifically the end of Tony. The comment said, Tony Stark is dead, and I had read that comment about 5 minutes or a couple minutes before he got to it, as he's scrolling through all the chats and questions and picking out the questions to respond to him. And so when he started talking about whatever, I knew, I'm like, oh, okay. Well, maybe it's not. I had convinced myself it might not be, but still, whatever. There is so much in the movie that you could not expect or predict. I just, again, all these character moments, that character moment for Hawkeye, there's the character moment for Captain America when he goes back in time to the 70s and he sees Agent Carter, and who's head of S.H.I.E.L.D. at the time. Just, beautiful dovetails into the Marvel MCU continuity, which, I love, because it's an adaptation of what the comics were. They did heavily always say, like, this is, or imply that this is a living, breathing history. And to see the movies tie back so much into the history of the MCU was astonishing. I did not expect it. For example, we all know going in, or at least most of us do, this part isn't even a spoiler, you knew that they were going back into Avengers 2012, the first Avengers movie in the Battle of New York. There were some spy photos that were released on the internet like a long time ago showing Chris Evans in his 2012 era Captain America costume. A costume which most people think is the weakest of the Captain America costumes. So the only reason why you'd have him in that costume is if you were doing time travel. And so, a lot of people knew that they were going to go back into a previous MCU movie. What shocked me was that they went back into almost every MCU movie, or at least it felt like. They certainly went back into every franchise. At least, every franchise in the MCU had a moment from that movie that they go back into in this movie. And, it was a stunning level of continuity shown in cinema, to the level which has probably never been seen in cinema and could possibly never be seen again, or at least until the next big Marvel event. But, you sometimes in movies will have references to something that happened earlier in a franchise, but it's fairly rare. So that level of continuity, that's something that's, really kind of new to cinema. There have been franchises going back to the early days of cinema. There would be series, the Andy Hardy series with Mickey Rooney. It would have the same actors playing the same characters in new stories about those characters, but still they were new stories about those characters. They didn't necessarily feel as much often as a continuation, or be self-referential and refer back to events that had happened, to this character or that character. And I mean, the level that they played with that here was just, it was fascinating. A moment. So I said that, the Tony Stark death was kind of spoiled for me, though I think most of us thought that either he or Chris Evans, Captain America, were going to die in this movie. And considering how central Iron Man is, and the fact that Downey, kind of wanted out, even though Chris Evans did as well, it wasn't exactly a shock. So it wasn't the worst spoiler to have. But like I said in my spoiler-free video, put the spoiler potentials aside. There were so many other moments that totally, you wouldn't have never predicted, would never be in spoiler, forums or posts or social media posts. And a big one after the Hawkeye one, that was certainly a big one. But then the next big one that I recall is Thor. When they go back in time, like I said, they kind of, they don't just go back to Avengers. They're going back throughout the Marvel history to find the Infinity Stones. And so when Thor and Rocket go back to Thor, the movie, or maybe it was Dark World, it was Dark World, and it was right before his mother, played by Renee Russo, is about to be killed. And when he sees her and he realizes that was just a sucker punch. Like I said, the best art, connects with you on an emotional level. And, there were actually many, many moments where different characters had that same experience that Thor did. The moment where Tony goes back to the 1970s and bumps into Howard Stark. In that same sequence of scenes, Chris Evans sees Haley Atwell, Agent Carter. It was kind of one after another. And I was telling my friends as we left the movie theater, I said, I was to the point where if another character gets a moment to talk to their passed away parent, I'm going to lose it. How can that make you not think of people you've lost in your life? And I lost my mom last year, and that was surprisingly powerful for me. I was digging into those napkin tissues that my buddy had given me. He'd give me a box of popcorn. Sorry, I thought I talked about this. I talked about it in the other video. And along with a bunch of napkins. And I was, multiple points throughout the movie, I was tearing up and blowing my nose, clearing out the schnoz. Those were, I think, moments that were so resonant for me. Again, a lot of times I go to these films to see them translate the more visual elements, the costumes and the powers and the action sequences, but those moments were key moments in the movie that just, again, by the end of it I was completely wrecked. Thanos, or as I used to pronounce him when I was reading comics, Thanos, because they never had pronunciators in comic books. Thanos, I was actually a bit disappointed in the first act of the film when they tracked Thanos down to his little retirement farm and they kill him very, abruptly, kind of, and not much of a battle. He's also effectively almost taken prisoner at that point, and Thor's just like, nah, I don't care. You're done. You killed trillions. Out. Taking your head off. I was kind of like, of course, because they don't want to get too graphic, you don't really see it, and so it wasn't much of a visual payoff, and it just happened so abruptly. I was kind of like, God, that was a little bit disappointing. So it was actually really rewarding to see, oh, okay, they're time traveling, so we're still getting our Thanos, and Thanos still invades, and we still actually get a more appropriate, duel with Thanos to conclude the story. That was actually pretty brilliant. I loved how that, I was like actually disappointed in the payoff, and then they paid it off more than I would have expected with that full scale invasion. Um, I thought that was good. There was also another little Easter egg in there. As I said in my spoiler-free review, there were no end credit sequences, and that disappointed some fans. I thought it was great because this was the end, a specific end to a huge chapter of the history of the MCU, and so since most of the post-credit sequences are either a comedic bit or a tease to the future, I thought it was best to end it as it ended. It ended on an emotional moment. A comedy post-credit sequence might deflate that dramatic tension. A tease to the future is a distraction from the monumental repercussions that Endgame had to the MCU. No, everybody should be focused on that. And they did do that end credit sequence with the signatures of the cast. Again, I was watching Robert Burnett when he mentioned that, and he did just mention that there was a little something that was kind of like Star Trek 6, and I remember that when the original cast during the credits sequence, it looked like they were signing their names to the screen or whatever, which is a really cool personal touch or whatever. So I loved it. And then the one thing that besides the Secret Wars reference that a lot of people did not realize is at the very end of the credits when the Marvel Studios logo comes on, if you listen hard, you hear some metal clanking. And I remember perking up when that happened. And I asked everyone around me if they heard that, and none of them really recalled hearing it as we were walking out of the theater. And I had to look it up online to see what that was, because I knew it was something. It had to be something. It was just too out of place after the music had faded down. And I think I saw it on a video on What Culture. It turns out that was actually audio from the very first MCU film, Iron Man, when Iron Man was banging his armor into shape when he was a prisoner in that cave in the Middle East. Once I found that out, I'm like, that was a perfect way to end it. I thought that was... Normally, I always want more, so I would have loved a post-credit sequence normally, but I love just the artistry and saying, okay, this is a bookend to Iron Man, and that the last thing that you see and hear, well, you don't see it, you hear it. The last thing you see is the Marvel Studios logo, and the last thing you hear, pang, 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 Tony Stark banging away 12 years ago. I just loved it. That was fantastic. So I'm not disappointed that there wasn't a post-credit sequence. Oh, okay, there's one thing about time travel that I almost forgot to mention that I loved was those stupid quantum suits were barely in it. Now, apologies if you like the quantum suits. They didn't look terrible, but I think, anytime you see a fresh approach to a character design, the uniqueness alone is kind of interesting. And like many people, I felt the same way. I thought, that's kind of interesting. That's cool. Doing the quantum, they got the quantum suits for that time travel purpose. But one thing I loved was the fact that when they did do time travel, as soon as they time traveled, those quantum suits disappeared. And the reason why I felt that way is because as cool as you think they are not as cool as the actual real costumes. So while you get a little bit of a jazz seeing a classic, iconic character in a fresh new look, a fresh take, every second after that first impression is a law of diminishing returns. It doesn't look as good at Captain America's suit, does not look as good as Captain America's real costume. So I loved that they found a way to, inject something new and different, and gives them a reason to sell another, version of the character for toys and such. And a lot of people eat that up. So that's great that we have that there for the people that love that. But then when it came down to brass tacks, it was the characters that we know and love, and looking like we know and love them. So I thought that was very cool. It was a way to kind of satisfy everybody, people that wanted something fresh, but also people that love the history of the MCU that, the whole thing is building upon. So that was something that was very cool, I thought. Okay, so I guess I'm kind of running out of spoiler moments that I can remember to discuss, so maybe I'll wrap it up and kind of just talk about the real ending of the film. There were so many moments during the final act that were just show-stopping moments that had people cheering in the theater. The beginning of the final confrontation with Thanos, where it has the original three Avengers, Captain America, Iron Man, and Thor, approaching Thanos. That was just them walking, that one shot, them walking towards Thanos was just so powerful. I loved it. That was just the original hardcore heart of the team. That final moment where, final moment not of the film, but, a final moment of what had begun 12 years earlier, culminating into a previous culmination against Thanos in Infinity War, but then escalating into this one. I loved it. And that fight, there were just, it happened so quickly. I need to watch it again, but there were just so many great moments that had people just like shouting and laughing. The one that just sticks out for me was when, first of all, I love the fact that I kind of skipped over this or didn't mention it, but the fact that Mjolnir is brought back into the MCU. For me, that was a freaking yeah. That was a moment. I was like, Stormbreaker is cool, but Stormbreaker is not Mjolnir. Okay, Mjolnir is one of the coolest weapons in comic book history. An iconic and foundational element of Thor. And to me, it was a little bit disappointing when he makes the transition to Stormbreaker. And so when he goes back in time and grabs the old version of Mjolnir and then is wielding double weapons, both Stormbreaker and Mjolnir, that was, you call it fan service or whatever you want. I don't care. I loved it. That was amazing. And when he's using both weapons at the same time against Thanos, and then, of course, at one of the great moments of that film was when Mjolnir flies off and into the hand of Steve Rogers, Captain America. Holy moly, I loved that. And that one shot of him coming at Thanos with shield in one hand and the other hand spinning Mjolnir just like Thor did, that was kick-ass. I don't care. Call it fan service if you want. That was awesome. And the crowd just went crazy. For that. And one person in our group was like, how come he can pick up Thor's hammer? First of all, I love that. I love that someone was skeptical because they know that not everyone can pick up Thor's hammer. Obviously, that's been in the movies, but you'd think for more casual fans that those kinds of really specific comic book details, don't make as much of an impact with the casual fan. They might forget that or whatever. So I love that. That stuck out in my friend's mind. And it was just awesome. We talked about how, well, technically, the Thor rule is that whomsoever can lift this hammer, be they worthy, will have the power of Thor. And just a great moment. A great moment that, and it's happened before in the comics, and other people have picked up Thor's hammer in the comics, but it's so rare, and it means something, because Captain America, he's worthy. So that was, and the fight that continued from that point, when Thor rejoins and they're both fighting Thanos together. I mean, that was just beautiful. Loved it. Effing loved it. I would have just been satisfied as a fan to see Mjolnir come back, and to see not only this double wielding of Stormbreaker and Mjolnir, and then Captain America gets into it. I mean, if you feel that's too fan servicey for you, then you're a jaded person. I think. I mean, who would not see Captain America wielding Mjolnir and his shield at the same time? It's just a striking image. I love it. They really did not care. They really just pulled out all. This is the final, penultimate movie. This is a movie where Robert Downey Jr. and Chris Evans are not going to return to the MCU. It certainly appears, and or even their characters. I'll talk about that in a moment. But so they just pulled out all the stops and said, okay, well, remember all those what ifs? Let's do a bunch of those. What if Captain America picked up Thor's hammer? And of course, when I think about it, they actually did have a moment where Captain America tried to pick up Thor's hammer in the first Avengers, and I actually was kind of pissed that he couldn't pick it up. But it is such a great moment, because it starts to jiggle a little bit and like freaks Thor out, like, holy crap, this dude might actually be able to do it. So it was such a good moment that it didn't bother me too much. But deep down I was like, excuse me, is there any more pure of heart than Captain America? No, he should be able to pick that mofo up. So just some astounding moments that you never thought you would see on the screen. It delivered. The movie delivered on almost every level. I'm very interested. I'm going to scour the internet and find out what everybody's complaining about, because everybody complains about, well, in every movie, someone complains about something. And so I'm interested to see what people didn't like about it, because I can't find much. I'm a skeptical person, and I was so tickled through the entire movie. It was just like hitting all of the erogenous zones, if you're a comic book superhero movie adaptation fan. And it's just an amazing experience. If you're old enough to know the pre-geek singularity life, that's what Robert Burnett, who I mentioned, calls it. He says we're in the post-geek singularity, where these things have reached a critical mass as far as being popular in culture. And for so long that was not the case. For so long we struggled to get any decent comic book adaptations, and even the decent ones often had some really stupid crap in them, like the first Superman movie. Who doesn't love that? But man, there were some corny moments in that movie, and where who would have imagined that we would go from that to Captain America picking up Thor's hammer? I mean, all of the predetermined steps that would need to happen to allow that part of the story to happen, you just would think it would never all be able to come into place. And so I can see how, I'm sure some people are going to say that that this is very fan servicey, and to those people, I say I don't see it. Yes, they were fan servicey, but that implies that fan service is a negative inherently. If it connects to the story and is justified through the character and story, then it's technically not fan service. Fan service in its traditional sense is something that's thrown in just to tickle the fans, and not because it fits so well with the story or the narrative to that point. So these moments work. They were just brilliantly executed. Crowd pleasers, tons of them, just over and over. But that final sequence, maybe not the final sequence, but that sequence with Captain America, Iron Man, and Thor, and specifically that part with Captain America and Thor was, it's like if that alone, if the movie had tanked, that would be like something I would have walked out of the theater and said, I am so glad I got to see that. Boy, that movie sucked, but man, did they kill it at that moment. And but it didn't. It was a great moment wrapped in an incredible movie. And man, Avengers was an experience. MCU and Kevin Feige and Marvel have changed Hollywood, and one of the aspects that most people don't understand about how they've changed Hollywood, they poo-poo this shared universe, but the power of serialized storytelling is something that's important to narrative. If you go with a character on a journey, whatever, even if it's a single self-contained movie, at the end of that journey, you have an emotional response to that journey. Well, what if that journey is 3 times as long, or 10 times as long, or covers several movies? The longer that journey goes on, the more potential it has to resonate with you. And that's the power of serialized storytelling that is very often overlooked by mainstream sources. These characters we've been inviting into our world, whether it be through cinema or viewings on television or Blu-ray or what have you, or streaming, these are characters that we like, that we are inviting into our lives, and after doing it for over 2 decades, we've become attached to these characters. Some of us were attached long before the MCU came out, and just the perfect crystallization of those characters in the MCU. I look at Chris Evans and Robert Downey Jr. Even though Robert Downey Jr. is a little bit off of what I would have expected for Tony Stark, who can deny its brilliance? But for Chris Evans, it really feels like a crystallization of that character. Dialogue might be different, plot points might be different, but it just feels so true to what Captain America is. These things build over time, and it makes an impact on you, and it made a big impact on me. I think it was an emotional roller coaster. I was completely emotionally and even physically drained by the end of it. I was sweating. It was a cinematic experience I won't forget. It's one of my top cinematic experiences as long as I've been watching films. I remember watching Rocky IV in the early mid-'80s. I think that came out in 84. And it was one of the greatest movie watching experiences I'd ever had, because I'd never seen a crowd so responsive, because there was so much going on in the culture at the time, and that movie was really a metaphor that people could project onto their hopes or fears or concerns of the Cold War conflict we had with Russia at the time. And that's something that you you just cannot understand until you see that context. And this was one of the theater experiences I had, one of the only theater experiences I've had that could rival that. The crowd was felt such an impact from so many of the dramatic moments, and you could feel it, you could hear it, you could see it sometimes. You'd see people's, hands raise up, yeah. So sometimes you'd see it like in front of you, you'd see a couple hands raise up or something. It was one of the most responsive crowd experiences I've ever seen, and it was an amazing achievement. And it'll go down as that. It doesn't need me to say that. It will go down as one of the great movie-going experiences of the era, I believe. So I'm like really stoked to see it again and try and process more of it, see what else I pick up from it. It was just an amazing juggling act that you never thought would have ended with the juggler holding on to everything, and they did it. Like Robert Burnett said on John Campia's show, they stuck the landing. I'm just kind of blown away. I'm like finally kind of back to normal after watching it. It's been like 2-3 hours now, and I just like for so long I just felt like on edge. I just wanted to call people and say, have you seen this? Oh my god, I can't believe what I just saw. So if you made it all the way to the end of this video, apologies if I was a little bit rambling. I knew I was going to be. I knew I didn't have time or even the wherewithal to like write out a script or whatever. I'm just going to kind of like go freestyle from topic to topic and just try and talk a little bit about some of these amazing moments that had such an impact for me. And if they did for you, please tell me. Or if there's other ones I missed. I mean, I know there's a lot of moments that I didn't get to, and some I just might be blanking on because it was just all so much sensory overload. But this is one video where spoiler it up in the comments below. If there's anything that made an impact on you that I didn't mention, feel free to mention it. This is a spoiler discussion. Let's have some fun with it. So thank you so much for watching. If you like the video, check out some of our other videos or like and subscribe. If not, no big deal. I hope we see you next time here in Hero Journalism.